present at this point in time, and then we will take the bio break right after that. So Ingrid, if you could introduce our keynote. Thank you.
Thank you, Norma, and thank you, Dr. Jean Kelly. This is a new feature or thing we are doing at our General Assembly. It was a suggestion of our networks, a suggestion of Maria Auxiliadora in one of our board meetings, to bring in not only, hard facts and data on the network, but to also have the opportunity to together as a community reflect and think of some topics. As Carl presented earlier, we are doing a lot of work in the network in and around agroecology. This is very likely to increase. So that's why we invited, also as per suggestion of David, we invited Dr. Jean Kelly, who graciously accepted to talk to us today on this topic. So Jean is a professor of pedology, deputy director of the Colorado Agricultural Experiment Station, and is associate director for research in the School of Global Environmental Sustainability at Colorado State University. He received his bachelor and master degrees from Colorado State University and his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Conducts a lot of research on and lectures nationally in the US and internationally on various aspects of soils, as his photo could even show. I noticed a guitar photo with a soil shirt as related to global change issues. His scientific specialization is in pedology and geochemistry. He has lots of accolades, serves as in many capacities, was also awarded or recipient of the 2016 Soil Science Society of America Research Award. He's a native of New York, a marathoner and a triathlete. And we are happy that he can talk to us today. Thank you, Jean.
Well, good morning, and I apologize for that bio. I don't think I gave that. I think that must have been taken off the internet or something, so it was a little bit too lengthy. But good morning, everybody, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm honored to talk about agroecology. It's something that I've been working on for the last almost 35 years, and in various aspects of agroecology. So what I thought I would do is just sort of give an overview, try to provide some thought-provoking sort of questions to you guys, and sort of see where we are as a discipline. A lot of the stuff I'm dealing with over here in North America deals with the concepts of regenerative ag now, and that seems to be something that scientists have not fully embraced. And what I'm finding as a soil scientist is many more of the scientists are now in favor of something like agroecology, which 25 years ago would have been unheard of in some of the mainstream agricultural schools in North America. So anyway, so I thought I'd provide an overview. I'll try to leave some time at the end for questions. You can feel free to stop me at any time. I used a lot of the material from my research program and my lectures, and so there'll be a hybridization of some of the materials that you'll see. But I will put my talk up and I'll share my screen. Is that right, Ingrid? I'll just do that now.
Yeah, you can do that.
Okay, so you should see yourselves. Let me see. All right, and then all my sons, I don't want them on there. Hold on a second. Let me put this up. There we go. We all good? I hear some music in the background.
Natalie, thank you.
Okay. Anyway, can you guys see my screen now? I think you can. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, my slides. Okay, so but basically what I'll do is I'll sort of march through this. It should be about 20 minutes, talking about agroecology and more or less looking at it from a sustainability, regenerative ag, and what we would call resilience in agriculture. I've worked a bit in Africa. I've worked in Tanzania. Spent quite a bit of time in South Africa and Namibia, and so I'm familiar with some of the challenges that we're having there with regard to the cultivation and cultivation practices. I am a soil scientist, so I take everything from the perspective of soils mostly, and I'm an ecologist as well. So this talk sort of covers most of my expertise. I'll talk a little bit about the global context, the global change in the broader context of what that means for agriculture globally, with some of what I call the constraints that we have. I'll talk about what I call ecological rules, and a lot of the work in agroecology has been foundational for the discipline as of now. I had not looked back at the literature. It's actually quite extensive prior to much of the work that's been done in ecology. So I'll point that out. I'll talk about what we know and what we think we know, and share that with you as far as our understanding of these systems, which is becoming quite important because we're struggling with having science being accepted by our stakeholders and our cooperators. And I imagine that trying to get our stakeholders involved as well is important. I'll mention the 3 planetary constraints and just provide some thoughts on that, because that's what I do a lot of the times these days. I'll talk a little bit about the aspects of regenerative thinking and then what I think we should worry about. Anyway, so when I started out working in the areas of ecology, there were lots of thoughts about what's happening to our planet, and thinking that things were changing very dramatically in terms of the natural resources and agricultural resources. And there was a comment by Slobokin back in 1962. This is prior to when I was in school. I'm not that old. And his tenet was basically that we'll reasonably expect to have a complete theory for ecology that will not only provide a guide for practical solutions of land utilization, pest eradication, exploitation problems, but will explain the past and also predict the future of the earth. So this was a very noble and I think aspirational sort of comment back in 1962, when the concepts of global change and climate change were sort of just being formulated by the scientific community. More recently, a colleague of mine, Peter Vertusik from Stanford University, had made a comment, which I always use in my classes, is that we're changing the earth more rapidly than we're understanding it. So that there was a sense of urgency now. This was back in the 1990s, and we know today that this is really the case that we're dealing with globally in terms of our soil and food resources. And then finally, sorry, back up a second. Here we go. Wow, am I going backwards? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. And then the last one is the comment that I've used in my class, and I think what's accepted now by most academic programs, is that the environment is no longer just this abstract concept. It begins with your home, your community, and your family, and we're all at the mercy now of global forces. And I think that became very evident during the pandemic and other aspects of what's been going on with climate change around the planet. Agroecological thinking has actually been in place for quite a while. Hold on, this is not just a slide. Yeah, there it goes. Has been in place for quite a while. And I went back and looked at the literature back in the 1930s and 40s. It had been sort of suggested that this might be an approach for food production. It's really just the relationship between agricultural systems and ecological processes. And so that requires us to have some very strong sense of the processes that are going on in our natural ecosystems and apply these to production systems. It really does provide what we call prescribed practices for specific ecological environments. And so if you adhere to these principles, it can be very useful at many scales. It's highly interdisciplinary, incorporating agronomy, agriculture, ecology, economics, and of course, social sciences. We like to think of it as being integrative, and that a lot of the areas of organic agriculture and conventional agriculture can be incorporated, things like permaculture, and these all contribute to the aspects of sustainable development globally. And I think the most important thing is that it really proposes a context or site-based formula. So there really is no specific formula to any one problem. You have to have a pretty good understanding of the resource base that you're working with and what the challenges are at any specific sort of location. Many of the common principles that we understand about climate change and agriculture are depicted in this schematic. And you can see the upper part of it is what I call the biophysical template. We have the consumptive portion of it, and of course the farm response. And we know that with increasing temperatures and shifts in rainfall patterns, we're seeing changes in our agricultural production, and in many cases decreasing production. And then we know that this has a strong influence on the demand for food, the prices for food. And our challenge is really how we're going to respond. And there's been a concept of something called intensification of agriculture, which is being practiced in some places. And this becomes sort of a challenge, especially when we're looking at the cost of energy and fertilizers and all of those things. the understanding is that there needs to be some adaptation, and how do we address that? And what are the principles that we use to address the adaptations that will be used in our food production systems? Just to reiterate, many of you are aware and know that agriculture is a highly successful, it's the largest industry on the planet, as I tell my students and my graduate students. It's been highly successful. It's allowed the planet to flourish. However, we've exploited much of the landmass and land area of the planet in food production, and we understand now that there are challenges with the way industrial agriculture is being conducted. What we know is about 21% of the greenhouse gas emissions are related to agriculture, and this is also including land clearing in places like South America and in Africa. We know it's a dominant source of greenhouse gases, mostly CO2, but methane is becoming quite challenging and of interest to the scientific community, particularly from the livestock end of things, and rice production in Southeast Asia. And what we know is that on the planet, we need to, increase our food production or double the food production in over a 50-year period. And in conventional agriculture in many places, the answer to that is really increasing production through adding fertilizer. So the schematic to the right just basically shows if we're showing 100 megatons of nitrogen being added in 2005, and we put that up to 250, that will be required to double the food production in 2050. That adds 3 gigatons of carbon to the atmosphere. And that's primarily the result of not only the increased land area that's needed, but the production of fertilizers is very energy intensive. And so it seems that these data would suggest that we need to move away from using some of the conventional sort of fertilizers that are used in producing food globally. This is my favorite picture, and I just thought I would show you. This is the soil right outside not outside my house, but outside my research site here in the Western Great Plains of North America. And what I wanted to talk about was what we know and how we know it. So we spend a lot of time looking at soils around the world and looking at the key properties and how they function. And the idea is to really get a handle on the processes that are key to the functional aspects of soil. Now, this is a native soil that's used for grazing in the Western Great Plains of North America. And we spend a lot of time characterizing these soils, understanding how they form, how they behave, and how they can be used for food production. As you'll note in the upper part where it says soil horizons, the brown portion is really what we're looking at. Can you see my pointer? Yeah, there we go. This is the upper part that has the organic matter, the organic rich layers. Down here or in our arid environments, we have a lot of salts, mostly calcium carbonate. Trying to capitalize on this portion of the soil and protecting this from things like soil erosion is some of the things that I've been studying. One of the many things that we understand pretty well is research on soil organic matter, and particularly of interest lately is soil organic carbon. I'll refer to soil organic matter. I believe it's more integrative. I think it applies globally to food systems research. This is just a schematic that shows the dynamics of soils over time. What you can see in this schematic, you have organic matter on the y-axis, and on the bottom you'll see time. You'll see what we have a native system. We call those natural systems. And what we understand from over 150 years of research is that once we cultivate a soil, and particularly this is actually relevant not only in North America, South America, Africa, and parts of Asia and Europe, that after a cultivation, immediately we lose about 40 to 50% of the soil organic matter as a result of the cultivation practices, removing the natural vegetation and accelerating microbial activity. What you can see is that over time, this continues to decline because we're still losing soil nutrients to the production of agriculture. Now, if we add fertilizers like right in here or do some improved management, we can bring the system back, right, across some threshold. And then again, with improved management, but looking here, much higher inputs, it takes an enormous amount of inputs to get it back to where it was prior to it being cultured. Now, in the areas that I've been working, many of these sites have been cultured for over 100 years. Remember, in the first 4 to 5 years, that's when you're losing 30 to 40% of the organic matter in many systems. And what I state here is that a grand challenge to looking at intensification of agriculture and agroecological processes is to really have a better holistic understanding of soils and how they behave over space and time. So the next figure is just a schematic that really looks at the processes that we're talking about. So the platelet on the left is what I call an undisturbed soil. This would be that native soil that I just previously showed. And what we understand is that plant inputs are extremely important in supporting the health and vitality of the soil. We understand that microbial respiration plays a major role in releasing CO2 to the atmosphere. And there is, in a sense, a balance of nutrients in these natural systems. We have soil formation, a bit of erosion, but in most natural systems, over geologic timescales, soil erosion and soil production balance each other out. They're not well out of balance. And again, same with nutrient inputs. But the minute we domesticate a soil, we plant, we culture it, we do whatever we're going to use it for, even for intensive grazing or grazing opportunities, we see that the balance of these processes really shift, particularly with regard to the amount of erosion that occurs and the increase in microbial CO2 that is being emitted to the atmosphere. Again, the production level might or might not be the same, but what we're starting to see here is a depletion of the organic rich materials in the surface, and then more losses of material through the profile because we've lost a lot of the capacity of the soil to supply and regenerate the nutrients. So these are the kinds of processes that we've been studying globally, and we have a pretty good understanding of what it takes to sort of get a system back to here. But you know, with most of the technology, where we are now is, again, going back to the previous figure, this requires a lot of inputs. And the difference there is the trajectory for recovery is much slower. So we might lose 40 to 50% of the organic matter in 3 to 5 years. And what we're finding in our research, it takes almost 25 to 30 years to put that material back. So one of my things that I point out with all my lectures is that this is something we need to think about in the agricultural community from a number of standpoints, but our number one constraint is really the land conversion for crop production. And that in many areas of the world, we're nearing our planetary limit of using soils. All the soils that are being cultivated now are being depleted. We've used most of the good land. So we need to come up with different ways of thinking and designing different systems for agricultural production. I wanted to show this figure because this has become sort of a thing that I've been sort of embroiled in, and I'm not that I'm pleased with being embroiled in it, but as many of you know or might not know, there is a real challenge globally and an attempt to use soils to mitigate increasing CO2 that's being produced mostly through the energy sector and of course in the agricultural sector. So the figure to the right is just a schematic, and I don't want to go into the details of these, but essentially these are numbers that have been worked over for the last 50 years. And essentially the story here is that the soil has about 25 pentagrams of carbon in it, and the atmosphere has about 880. So you look at that and you say, wow, this is a large reservoir of carbon. And this is the reservoir that we're increasing, right? In terms of global warming, this becomes of concern, right? And so you start looking at that, and scientists started sort of speculating, well, is there a way to take some of this CO2 and put it back into the soil? Now, this is an interesting concept. We've been studying this for almost 25 years. What we know is that in many cases, this becomes really challenging because of the rate at which carbon has to be fixed here. If we lose 40 to 50% of it in 4 to 5 years, maybe even 10 years, and it takes 30 years to put it back in, that creates a real challenge in using this as a mitigation strategy. We know food systems are responsible for about 34% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and there's about 3.5 petagrams of carbon from agricultural activities alone. We know that the sequestration potential, that's what they're using now in the scientific community, is extremely variable. So if we're losing about 3.5 a year, the rates of input are only about 0.28 to 0.43. And this is some recent literature. So right there, you're seeing we lose about 3.5. In most systems, we're only putting about a tenth of that back into the system. And what we know is that in order for the agricultural sector to be useful here, we need to come up with a system that we call carbon neutral. In other words, that we're producing food with a zero carbon footprint, right? So that really changes the landscape and the types of agricultural practices that we might be thinking about. And I use this here in my home territory because I really think this is an important thing to think about. And I think it's important to think about globally, particularly in light of what we've seen with COP27 with the idea of addressing climate change and using agriculture as an answer. So agriculture is not only a cause of climate change, now it's the answer. So I think we really need to make sure that science is backing these assumptions. I like a quote from, oops, excuse me, let me back up a second. The quote from Bill Schlesinger, he advises that we avoid the moral hazard for policymakers that fossil fuel emissions are tolerable because the agricultural sector will mitigate them. And I think that's a challenge that we're having here in North America, particularly in South America and parts of Europe. I imagine that it's going to be a problem globally pretty soon as nations try to address the greenhouse gas mitigation produced by agricultural practices. One other thing that we have to worry about in soils is water, and I know many of you are aware of that. We refer to water in agroecology as the master variable. In many cases, water is the key driver of the processes that go on in not only natural systems and in agricultural systems. So I thought I'd provide a bit of a view about water in our landscapes and how it pertains to agricultural practices. What we know, what we think we don't know. So this is the one I get kind of confused on because I study soils all over the world, and it's quite different in terms of the types of data that we get for these systems. What we do know is that non-ag ecosystems globally consume about 3/4 of the global green water. And what I mean by green water is the soil water that's available for plants to transpire. So let's just think of that reservoir of water. That's 3/4 of the global green water is in non-agricultural ecosystems, okay? The remaining 1/4 is partitioned between croplands and pasture lands globally. Okay, that's a pretty good number. What we also understand is that the flow of green water that we have in our natural systems and in our forests and grasslands and even our desert environments is about 65% of the total global flow of any fresh water. That's green or blue. Blue water is actually irrigation water, right? Lakes, rivers, and all of that. The quote that's sort of the comment, and I've checked this calculation, we just published a paper on this, the global flow of green water by transpiration matches all the rivers in the world. So what you have is you have systems that are a large reservoir of water, and we have to figure out how to utilize that water more appropriately for growing crops, sustaining livestock, and perhaps not using blue water or irrigation as a major practice for producing most of our foods. And we know that most of the food globally is produced by rain-fed, but in many areas that are marginally have marginal amounts of water available for production, this can become a key issue. So the second planetary constraint is the blue water is nearing its planetary limits as well. As many of you know, many of the major rivers around the world are drying up. Reservoirs are well below storage capacities. And this is creating lots of challenges in the industrialized world and also the under-industrialized world. So for example, in North America, the Colorado River Basin, which is an expansive area in Western North America, is well below where it should be, and it's actually affecting hydroelectric power and things like that. So we're seeing the integration of, or the intersection of agricultural and now affecting other aspects of our ecosystems. One last thing I want to talk about in terms, before I get into the depth of agroecology, is to sort of take a closer look at the differences in soils that we have around the world. And one of the things that we have to understand is how do we optimize this amount of soil water? And what we know is that some soils hold more water than others. So for example, this is an experiment I had out in, this is out in the southwestern US, where we have some soils that have very low holding capacities, some that have very high capacities, and others that have an intermediate capacity. The idea would be to be able to identify these landscapes and utilize these areas for production or any sort of ecological activity, grazing, because these systems tend to have a higher resilience to changes in temperature and precipitation regimes. Finally, the principles that we need to be applying once we understand what's going on in these systems deal with the following, and I'll run over these quickly. This is the enhancing of the biomass. So we don't really want to be adding fertilizer. We want to optimize the amount of organic matter that's returned to the system. We use the term, we want to strengthen the immune system of the agricultural system. And that really looks at something called functional biodiversity, where we're looking at different types of plants, microbial biodiversity. And what we understand is that redundancy in these systems creates more resilience. So designing systems that have high inputs of organic materials that are maintained within the system that provide a sustainable sort of nutrient supply. We want plant growth conditions to be favorable over a large area of geographic regions. We want to minimize the loss of energy, nutrients, and water. We want to diversify species, and we want to what we call enhance the biological interactions that we see in soils with our agroecology principles. So here's a simple schematic of something that we would refer to as one principle of agroecology, looking at diversity and redundancy in systems. And we think this is a really stable sort of aspect, and we should strive for these aspects. So looking at different types of plants that have different rooting depths can create a more efficient mining of nutrients and allow the different types of crops or whatever's being produced to exploit different aspects of the soil for production. In other words, mining water deeper, mining water near the surface. What we do understand from our research is that more biodiverse systems are much more resilient to environmental stresses such as drought. We've experimented with this in many types of systems. So biological diversity is really key. And then what really becomes important in many parts of the world will be scale. So let me go into that now. So if you just look at these data in terms of the sizes of farms, just take the reference was sort of left off on the bottom. If we just focus on sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, what we see is that a large percentage of the farms are small acreage farms. And these are much more suitable for agroecological production as opposed to places like in North America where we have large production farms. Many of the farms are very large. Look at places like Australia, the same thing. Scaling using ecological or agroecological principles will become very challenging in these sorts of environments. The opportunity is where smaller stakeholders, smaller land shares are used would provide a better chance of incorporating these principles. So we can look at the differences between medium and small farms. These are global sort of numbers. You see, of course, small farms produce a majority of the world's major foods with many of the essential vitamins that are needed. But also you'll see that there is a place for large agriculture. Although they tend to be less diverse, they actually produce many of the sugar and oil crops that are used, and nearly half of the calcium comes from these large land areas. What I like to look at is some slides that I had. These are from different areas of the world in terms of the sizes of smart, oh no, hold on a second. Sorry about that. Oh, there we go. The sizes of farms. Here we see a high density of small farms. This is in Sichuan area of China, as opposed to what we see in parts of Africa where we have very diverse landscapes of small farms interspersed with grazing. We can see a mixture of small and medium farms. This is over in Europe and the south of France. And then, of course, very large farms that we see in Brazil. The idea is to create a mosaic of land uses, and that this agroecology and the diversity is not only at a specific site, but we need to look at it at a landscape level. So we have a much more diverse, or the potential for a higher diversity of landscape here than something like this. I'm getting to the end. So what do we need to know? Well, what should we worry about? So this is the third constraint, and this is the one that I have a bit of fun with. This is time. And so I teach and I lecture on this often, that time becomes really important in terms of what we're doing. What I find is the major challenges is that we need to get operations and practices on the ground immediately, because the decisions we make today are much more important than the decisions we're going to make in 5 or 10 years. My father used to say, my father was an attorney. He was what they call a public defender in the US. And he used to say to me, Eugene, he said, the arc to moral justice is long, but the arc of injustice is long, but it points toward moral justice. It's a long arc. We'll get there. Climate change is really different. There's no negotiating with climate change. It's happening quickly. And I do think there's a sense of urgency in getting research and supporting extension activities that will implement practices that bring us closer to agroecological principles. With regard to agroecological principles, I've worked quite a bit with the Sustainable Development Goals, and what we know is transitioning agricultural ecosystems toward agroecological principles will really be central to addressing some of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is from my colleague, Miguel Altareri at University of California, Berkeley. And you can see that all of the Sustainable Development Goals are embedded in principles of agroecology. Finally, what we know is that agroecological principles that worked in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s are not the same of what we're dealing with. What we have now are 21st century boundaries that are very different based on what's happening on our planet in terms of population, climate change, and the way land is being used. 4 areas that we can focus on to help are what we call strategic utilization of soils, using the best soils and reduce or reinvent the land of marginal lands. So we take marginal lands out of production, perhaps use those for things like livestock grazing, but use our very best soils for growing our food crops. The second thing is infrastructure. Farmers and ranchers depend on reliable infrastructure. This could be roads, irrigation, all sorts of technology. There's also the concept of demand side approaches. In the United States, we struggle with food waste as they do in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, ours is on the other side of the supply chain, usually at the table or in the kitchen, whereas in parts of the unindustrialized world, we see food waste at the farm is much higher. And then finally, we need to reframe the scope and nature of the problem that we're dealing with. Again, a 21st century problem with 21st century boundary conditions and constraints. So using agroecological approaches is useful, but we have to integrate innovation. And one of the areas that I've been exploring is the idea of big data and projecting the multitude of data that we collect around the world and being able to forecast what areas are most suitable. Oops, let me turn this up, excuse me. Are most suitable for agricultural production. Okay, I'm running late. Okay, I'm almost done. So what we're working on is the big chapter of regenerative agriculture. You can see it really is integrative, interdisciplinary, looking not only at science, social sciences, biological sciences, but commercial and industry inputs as well. Anyway, I know I went through that pretty quickly. Here is my contact information if you'd like to talk sometime, or I can send you materials. I'm more than happy to share this PowerPoint with you if you wish. I'm at Colorado State University, and feel free to email me anytime. And it's a pleasure to have shared my thoughts with you. And I have a couple of minutes for questions if that'll work.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Gene. Any questions for Gene before he goes?
I see there is a comment in the chat. So regarding the presentation, maybe Gene, you can just share that with me and I will distribute to everyone.
Absolutely.
The minutes. So thank you. And I see there is a comment question, sorry, from Gary in the chat.
Yeah, it says a big question. What are the implications for extension? Which is really the key question. In other words, that we're doing all these things, and it really doesn't matter unless farmers start applying these practices. And so we have many of the same challenges in other parts of the world. And that's an area that we've been closing the pipeline between research and getting it out to our stakeholders. We're doing much more on-farm research now than we ever did in my memory, trying to engage our lead farmers, or what we call the leaders in communities. And what we find is that leaders in the communities, when they adopt these practices, that we do have people that will follow along with them. Question from somebody had a hand up there.
From David, and we also have another one in the chat from Gary.
Okay.
This is David. Thanks for that really fascinating presentation, Gene. I just wanted to also, focusing from the perspective of extension, everybody in this meeting is working with extension programs. I wanted to look at one of your slides you made the comment that in some parts of the world where most of the farms are small farms, small acreages, small plots.
This one? Yeah.
There was another one where you were comparing. We don't need to go to the slide.
Oh, okay. Okay.
This one, yeah. You were saying there's particularly strong possibilities of changing the way things are done or doing effective kinds of interventions on the small farms in areas where there are lots of small farms.
Absolutely, because of the scaling, right? In terms of when you start looking at the ecological processes, we have a very good understanding of those at a particular scale. So I think there's an opportunity for much more prescriptive sorts of opportunities and management strategies rather than blanket one size fits all. Yeah.
But the point I wanted to come to there was that in those areas, I'm working especially in Africa, but some of the other parts of the world where there are lots of small farms too. Right. These are the areas where the extension programs are probably the primary contact that small farm operators have with scientific judgment. And yet those are the places where extension programs may have the, it's the biggest challenge to bring a sophisticated message through. The extension people are the soldiers on the ground, but they're often not they don't have a lot of human capital, and there's not a strong system for giving them continuous reinforcement of what's going on. So that's a huge challenge we're facing.
It's huge. And I think that, maybe that's where innovation comes in. I'm not necessarily saying that we're going to tech our way through this, but I do think that we need to think of more innovative ways to get our scientists or our extension folks, more of them, but increase the training of our extension people, getting more people that are trained in extension and applying these principles, not necessarily researchers like myself, but people really practitioners. So creating apprenticeships and things like that would be really critical for areas where we're short of extension people.
So just my final comment, I think for the people in the meeting, I believe that creating a way of training and continuous training for the extension people working in extension and getting them involved with digital tools too, is one of our biggest challenges, and maybe should be a kind of a very strong focus for the networks we work in. How to do that.
That's a really good point. And I think it's something that constantly comes to the forefront. Anywhere I give a talk, it's always the same thing about extension programs and training the trainers, that sort of thing. So if we can go into local places and actually train, like we're doing this now in North America, believe it or not, with some of our soil health programs, we don't have enough people to outdo the technical work. What we're doing is we're training some of the farmers to work for us, and they're going out and working with other farmers. And so that's an opportunity as well. We in the US, we call them certificate programs, but it doesn't require a 4-year degree, but just a training, right? So we can increase that, and that would be enormous. Anyway, well, listen, I do have to dash to class. And so I really appreciate the opportunity. And Ingrid, I will send you this PowerPoint later on this afternoon. Okay.
Thank you. And maybe I see that there are some questions, so they can also be written in the chat, and we can forward it and then have this exchange.
That would be wonderful. And I'm more than happy to address those. No problem. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a safe day. Bye now.
Thank you.